Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. Brighton have had a superb start to the season. They're currently in 6th place in the Premier League table. But how have Brighton improved this season? What's different to last season? And can they qualify for Europe? So to talk about that and much more, I'm joined by Alex, aka EuroExpert. Really recommend his channel, guys. Links in the description below for all tactics and biographies of players and managers and much more. And if you're new to Garage Football as well, please subscribe to us for more vlogs, watch-alongs, and other content like this. So, Alex, thanks for joining us, mate. We've been playing this for a while, so thanks for coming on, bud. So, just before we get into Brighton's start to the season, and obviously comparing to last season, what do you make of Brighton's transition rather from from Chris Houghton as more of a pragmatic coach to Graham Potter's obviously more expansive and possession-based style? That doesn't always work when clubs try and do this. It ends in relegation. But I have to say, from my point of view, their transition has been absolutely incredible under Graham Potter. What say you?
Yeah, I'm much on the same wavelength. I'm not quite. We'll get into it. But I'm not quite as hot on Brighton this season, but they fully deserve the praise they're getting, especially Graham Potter, like his story. As well, from coaching Östersunds in Sweden. He's really put the work in because he was a former player, and he's really put the work in to get to where he's at. I think he's got a degree in emotional intelligence and leadership, and it's one of those things where when he came into Brighton, it was quite a safe bet. That even though he was trying to launch this sort of progressive transition, like you hinted at there, I don't think there was too many doubts he'd be able to implement it, just because of he clearly had the plan and he knew what he was going to do, and some of the players he's improved in his time there. That's the thing that's really stood out to me. It's one thing like getting your team playing a different way. I think a lot of managers can do that, but it's coaching players like Dan Burn and Yves Bissouma to play to a new level. That's what's really stood out to me.
Yeah, exactly, and it's not like they've spent a huge amount of money under Graham Potter. They're still mostly the same players that they had under the previous regime. So I think the coaching performance has been outstanding, as I say. So, in the title of the video, how have Brighton improved this season? I mean, what do you put it down to? Is it just them, having more shots on goal, just being more clinical front of goal? From what you've seen this season so far, albeit it's a small sample size, what's the improvements been for you?
Well, it's interesting because I think in some ways, I think Brighton are playing, well, not worse, but I think last season they were playing better than they are now in some ways. And there's reason to that because right now they sit 6th in the league. They've beaten Burnley, they've beaten Watford, they've beaten Leicester, drawn to Arsenal and Palace, and lost to Everton. And what happened last season really is that they were outperforming. They were getting unlucky the chances they had. So there's a measure that's usually linked with Brighton called expected goals, which is a measure of the quality of chance the team gets. So for anyone who doesn't know, a penalty will be worth 0.75, 75% chance someone will score a penalty. And Brighton basically, imagine them last season having about 30 penalties and missing, or just every time they had an open goal hitting the post. There's this season. They've got the 3rd best defense in the league. That's what's really kept them in, but they're quite low for the attack. And for shots, I think they're hitting the 7th least shots on target per game. But they're just getting more of them are going in, mainly from Neil Maupay, I'd say. He's already scored 4 goals, and he's someone, I mean, on a personal note, he's someone who might have made me a lot of money had Football Index not crashed. But that's another reality, sadly. But yeah, I think this season perhaps they're getting slightly more clinical, like hinted at. Maybe it's a bit of luck in front of goal, but that defense has really shored up. Even though last season it's great, this season it feels a bit more impenetrable.
Yeah, whether that's to do with Ben White leaving remains to be seen. But so what would you say is different then to last campaign? I think for me, yes, they did dominate a lot of matches, and they're probably not doing that maybe as much this season, but they're a lot more clinical. I mean, you mentioned Neil Maupay there, and as you say, he's already got 4 goals. He got 8 the previous season, 10 in his first season at Brighton, and the way he's going, he could easily reach double figures again, get 12, maybe to 15, and then maybe it's just the improvement of certain players who have got more used to Potter's style of play and also the Premier League style of play, rather than necessarily Brighton's changing in sort of formation tactics or anything like that. What do you think compared to sort of last season?
Yeah, I think you've kind of hit it there in terms of the players and the squad's really got more used to Potter. He hasn't overhauled anything. In fact, he's not used the same formation twice this season so far. I think he's used 7 different ones for each game, which is quite interesting. But with Potter, I mean, as we discussed at the start, his ideals, his targets always been to play possession football, to keep the ball, and which the reason being is you're more likely to stay in the Premier League if you can do that. And this season, they've really smashed it out of the park in that regard. They're holding the 5th most possession in the Premier League. They've made the 3rd most tackles in the final third of the pitch, which means basically they're pressing teams as much as Southampton and Liverpool, which is really interesting. And you could see it really against Arsenal. I think it stood out. That 0-0 draw where I think it's particularly the second half, Arsenal just kind of sat back and weirdly went to go on the counter-attack because they knew they wouldn't be able to pass their way out of Brighton's press, which is like a weird inversion of probably what we would have seen under Chris Houghton. But I think that's what's sort of developed under Potter now. The players like you said, it's much the same players as last season and the year before. They've just really grown into the system. And I think we're going to touch on the recruitment in a bit, but some of the players they've bought, they have barely played, but it's just more tweaking what's already there rather than overhauling anything.
Yeah, no, exactly, mate. And the thing is, the points wise is a lot better in comparison to all their season in the Premier League. I mean, their first season with Chris Hugh rather in the 17-18 season. They had 7 points after 7 games. And then in comparison to, say, last season, they only had 5 points from 7 games, really struggling, conceding a lot more goals, as you say. But they even scored more goals at this stage. They scored 11 after 7 games in comparison to 8. But as you quite rightly mentioned, the goals, again, this has dropped significantly. They conceded 14 after 7 games last season, and it's only 5 this season, which has been a huge turnaround. And also in terms of the stats, I think goals for this season is obviously a small sample size, but it's 1.14 average goals a game, and in last season it was 1.05. So there's small improvements, but I think if anything, it's the defensive capabilities, and obviously having who's the goalkeeper from the start?
Robert Sanchez.
Yeah,
Sanchez.
Yeah, because didn't Matty Ryan start the season last season as well?
Yeah, and Brighton fans weren't the biggest fan of him.
Yeah. So I think having Sanchez start the season has been a key factor as well. But in terms of obviously it's still early days, but with the likes of Tottenham and, say, Arsenal in transitional seasons, and the likes of Aston Villa, my team, West Ham, and Everton are going well. Do you think that Brighton can sustain this and challenge those clubs for European spots for the rest of the season?
I think they will drop off a bit, and I think if you'd asked me after maybe the first 4 games, might have backed that more. But the thing that really got me was their game against Palace. But I watched every minute of that, and I redid it because I was doing an article for it. And Palace under Patrick Vieira, who are really far earlier in their development than Brighton, they played them off the park. And it did go to show that while Potter's definitely improved, I think where Brighton will end up is somewhere between their early form this season and last season's bad luck in a way. I reckon they're going to end up maybe 9th or 10th, just because they're not without weakness. Like Everton dispatched them 2-0. Their win against Leicester came off 2 goals were disallowed. I think their win against Watford came from a set piece and quite a lucky goal after Watford played out the back. So I think they're running hot at the moment, but yeah, it's not really to take away from what they've done. Like that defense is really going to hold firm. I was speaking to an Arsenal fan actually after that 0-0 draw, and he was absolutely fuming because of just how he said Brighton play anti-football. Yeah, not in the sense of a Mourinho, but more they've just got a bunch of trees at the back who you just can't get past. They clear everything that comes their way. So just physically, there's such a mismatch, and they're playing this good football, where it's a weird thing. I wouldn't rule out them getting into Europe, but I definitely still would be surprised.
Yeah, no, exactly, mate. I totally agree with that. Do you think I haven't looked this up? So Brighton fans, if this is the case, then let us know in the comments. But I mean, whether it was the same last year, but this season is definitely different in terms of the amount of late wins and late goals they get in. Whether that's different to last season, obviously, you might be able to tell me, Alex, or Brighton fans in the comments, but like they beat Burnley away on the first game that was late on. They obviously got that draw away at Crystal Palace a couple of games ago, and they beat Brentford. Brentford's only defeat of the season. That was to Brighton. That was in the last minute as well. So surely that's a good sign as well, where they don't have to play absolutely amazing for the 90 minutes. They can just, if they can hold firm and get wins right at the end, like Fergie time. Sorry, Alex Ferguson, like Man United. Like, if surely that's a good improvement if they didn't quite do that in the previous seasons.
Potentially, yeah. It's quite early to say, obviously, if it's part of any pattern. But what it does do is definitely help build momentum. For example, that Palace game, like I mentioned, they were played off the park for the majority of the game. The Brighton fans listening will hate me for that because obviously that rivalry there.
Yeah.
But I think they were even laughing about how they got the draw, so I don't think they'll be too opposed to it. But what that last minute goal did is kind of save a game from, oh my God, we've played awful, to right now with Brighton, we're still building something. So even if it isn't part of a pattern, it's importing it in these early stages.
Yeah, without that, if you can't win a game, don't lose it, and they've made a good habit out for most of the games this season. And they mentioned the Arsenal game, before the Nationals, mate, and that was 0-0. But Brighton, I watched the game, and Brighton should have won. But for me, that reminded me of Brighton last season, where they just dominate matches, but were properly get in front of the goal. But for me, that's been a rarity this season. What say you?
I think this is the issue with them. I think more that I think with the Arsenal game, I kind of hinted towards it before. When Arsenal was sitting back, I think it was more of their decision rather than them getting pinned in. Like, Brighton were brilliant at trapping them inside their own half. But I think after the second half, Arteta kind of communicated to his players, like, the best way we could probably attack this Brighton side is if we sit back and counter-attack them. And they almost did when Smith Rowe went one-on-one, like, late in the second half. That was the best chance of the game, easily. So it's a wonder if more teams do that who are good at defending, because Brighton last season, I think what caught teams off guard, and it's going to be the same for their rivals Palace, is that no one's expecting them to play this possession football, and they haven't got enough data or footage to see like how they play it, which players move where, their patterns of play. Whereas this season, Brighton have already got a year of that, so teams are going to be better prepared, like Arsenal, to defend against them. So Arsenal, really, that game is definitely a bigger test. Like you mentioned it there, last season, you felt like they didn't create the chances. I reckon they might struggle even more to do that, and they're going to have to up their game to make sure they keep winning games, drawing and hitting the goals that they have so far.
Yeah, without a doubt. And so if they're going to sustain this brilliant form, what do you think they need to do? Maybe what does they need to do, something tactically, or is it just more the same, and eventually they'll get more wins and sustain their fantastic position?
I would say more of the same, I guess, in terms of, like I said, it's quite early, but I think he's getting really the maximum you can get out of these players. Like I have just said that, like, they're gonna have to up their level still, but really, Graham Potter, there's not much else he could do out of a front line of Maupay and Welbeck, with Trossard and Alexis McAllister in behind. Like, these are good players, but they're not like elite players. Like, they could suffer a problem like for a comparison, Chelsea played Juventus a couple of weeks ago, and Chelsea are a very good team, but Juventus have an amazing defense, so that was kind of unstoppable force meeting a movable object. And on a much lesser extent, you might get that with Brighton this season. So I wouldn't blame them. Like, I can't expect Potter to tweak anything. I don't think there's anything obvious. There's not much he's doing wrong at all. But it's just a question of how well they'll perform over the course of the season, I reckon.
Yeah, well, and that's always a challenge for a team that's not really expected to be in the European spots. But also, there's January coming up as well. So if they get a couple of right additions, they might be able to sustain the challenge. I mean, my team, West Ham, we managed to get Jesse Lingard in the January window, and he was, an incredible signing. Obviously, only on loan, but he's one of our key players in us finishing sixth last season. So if Brighton could pull a couple of rabbits out of the hat, then you never know. So just to finish up, Alex, just to put on the spot, and I'll give my prediction as well. But where do you think Brighton will ultimately finish this season?
I could sense what you're about to ask. I gave myself a chance to think about it. I'm going to say ninth. I'm going to say ninth. I reckon ninth.
Yeah, good stuff. I think I think they'll scrape top 10 and actually finish 10th. So, but which will still be a unbelievable season.
That'd be great, especially compared to last season.
Yeah, no, definitely. Great. Well, thanks a lot for joining, Alex. Really appreciate your time. Thanks everyone for watching. Subscribe to Gash Football if you're new, and subscribe to Alex's channel, EuroExpert, as well. Description, links in the description below, rather. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you soon. All the best. Bye-bye.